The lawyer looked at me, then at the folder in front of him. Ethan Carter is to receive the 2012 Ford Explorer currently registered in the estate. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then my older brother Daniel laughed, not a nervous laugh. A real laugh. My father smiled, too. Around that conference table, relatives who had just inherited millions tried to hide their amusement. My billionaire grandfather had left my father a substantial investment portfolio. Daniel received several properties and a generous trust. My cousins received stocks, cash, and pieces of businesses they had never worked for. And me? A 12-year-old Ford Explorer. Daniel leaned toward me. Seriously, Ethan? You got a used car while the rest of us got millions? I looked at the estate attorney. That's it? He nodded. The vehicle is yours, free and clear. I looked around the room. Nobody looked disappointed for me. They looked relieved, as if my inheritance had been the one problem they never wanted to deal with. My father cleared his throat. Your grandfather always had an unusual sense of humor. A few relatives laughed again. I didn't. I simply reached for the keys, but before I left, the attorney stopped me. There is one more instruction concerning the vehicle. I turned around. What kind of instruction? He looked down at the document. Your grandfather specifically ordered that nothing inside the vehicle be removed before you received it. My father suddenly became very interested. Arthur left instructions about a car? The attorney nodded. Yes. For just a second, my father's expression changed. It was quick, almost impossible to notice. But I noticed it, and that was the moment I realized the old Explorer might not be what everyone in that room thought it was. My name is Ethan Carter. And that afternoon, I drove away from my grandfather's inheritance hearing, believing I had received almost nothing. I was wrong. I just didn't know yet that the cheapest thing my grandfather owned was about to lead me to the most expensive secret my family had ever tried to hide. I drove the Explorer home that afternoon. It wasn't exactly falling apart, but it wasn't impressive either. The seats were worn. There was a faded coffee stain near the center console. The plastic cup holder was cracked. The inside smelled faintly of leather, dust, and the pine-scented air freshener people use when they're trying to make an old car feel newer than it really is. I opened the glove compartment, insurance papers, DART owner's manual, tire pressure gauge. Nothing unusual. I checked beneath the seats. Nothing. I was about to close the driver's door when I noticed the GPS. It was an older built-in navigation system. I turned it on. There was only one saved destination. Home. I stared at the screen. Home. At first, I assumed the previous owner had simply forgotten to erase it. Then I remembered the attorney's warning. Nothing inside the vehicle was supposed to be removed. Curiosity got the better of me. I pressed the destination. The route appeared. It led west, away from the city, toward the Appalachian foothills. I almost turned the system off. Instead, I started the engine. For the next 3 hours, I drove. The suburbs slowly disappeared. Then came farmland. Then smaller towns. Then quiet roads surrounded by trees. Cell service weakened. Gas stations became fewer. And the farther I drove, the more I wondered why my grandfather had wanted me to come here. As evening approached, the GPS directed me onto a narrow mountain road. Eventually, the pavement ended. The Explorer rolled onto gravel. Then I saw the overlook. There were no houses, no businesses, just mountains, trees, and a wide valley stretching beneath the fading evening light. I turned off the engine. That's when I saw him. An elderly man stood beside an old pickup truck near the railing. He wore a faded denim jacket and work boots. He looked at the Explorer, then he looked at me, and he wasn't surprised. He walked toward my window. I lowered it. Can I help you? He studied my face. You're Ethan. My stomach tightened. How do you know my name? He didn't answer. Instead, he looked toward the passenger seat. Did Arthur leave you the car? I nodded. The old man exhaled. Then he kept his promise. I stepped out. Who are you? He extended his hand. My name is Samuel Reed. I shook it. His grip was stronger than I expected. Your grandfather told me something. What? Samuel looked directly into my eyes. He said that if you ever came here, you'd probably be angry. I almost laughed. Angry? At your family. At him. maybe even at yourself. I looked back at the explorer. You know what happened today? I know exactly what happened. My throat tightened. Then tell me why he gave me a used car. Samuel glanced toward the mountains. Because the car isn't what he left you. He reached into his jacket, then he pulled out a small brass key. I stared at it. What does that open? Samuel closed his fingers around the key. That's what you're going to find out. He paused. But before you do, Ethan, you need to understand something. What? Your grandfather didn't trust the people who inherited his money. A chill moved through me. Then who did he trust? Samuel looked at me. You. For the first time that day, I had no answer. Samuel walked toward the rear of the Explorer. There is something inside that car you need to see first. He opened the rear hatch. Then he knelt beside the cargo floor. He ran his fingers along the edge of the carpet. There. I looked closely. At first, I saw nothing. Then I noticed a tiny metal latch hidden beneath the carpet. I pulled it. The floor lifted. Underneath was a shallow compartment. Inside sat a small black metal box. I stared at it. How did you know that was there? Because I helped your grandfather put it there. My heart started beating faster. Samuel handed me the brass key. It fit the lock perfectly. Inside were 4 things: an old photograph, a folded property deed, a handwritten letter, and a small envelope with my name on it. Ethan. My hand suddenly felt unsteady. I picked up the photograph first. It showed my grandfather as a much younger man standing beside Samuel in front of what looked like an unfinished construction site. Arthur was smiling. Samuel wasn't. On the back was a date from more than 30 years earlier. I unfolded the letter. The handwriting was unmistakably my grandfather's. Ethan, if you're reading this, then you probably believe I left you almost nothing. I stopped. Samuel watched me quietly. I continued. That is exactly what I wanted you to believe. I swallowed. Arthur explained that he'd spent his final years watching his family change. People who once visited because they loved him had slowly begun visiting because they wanted something. He wrote that he wasn't disappointed by money itself. He was disappointed by what money revealed. Then I reached the sentence that made me sit down on the tailgate. I have reason to believe that someone close to me has been moving money out of the company without my permission. I looked at Samuel. He nodded. Keep reading. Arthur wrote that he had hired private investigators and forensic accountants without telling the family. The investigation had uncovered suspicious payments made through consulting companies. Millions of dollars had disappeared over several years. The names weren't directly connected to the family, but the people receiving the money were. My stomach tightened. I looked at Samuel. Does this involve my father? He didn't answer. I looked back at the letter. Arthur explained why he had deliberately kept me away from the family business. He believed I was the only person in the family who hadn't become dependent on the Carter fortune. Then came another sentence. Your father believes money is power. Your brother believes money is proof that he matters. I want you to understand that money is only a tool. I stared at those words. Then I opened the envelope. Inside was another note, shorter this time. Do not confront your father. Do not tell Daniel what you found. Take the deed to my attorney. Then ask him about the Carter Family Trust. I looked up. What's the Carter Family Trust? Samuel sighed. Something your grandfather created before he died. Why didn't anyone mention it today? Because they don't know everything. That surprised me. My grandfather had just divided millions of dollars among his family, and somehow there was another trust nobody knew about. I looked at the property deed. The name on it wasn't a person. It was a mountain property, the same area where we were standing. Why does he own this place? Samuel smiled faintly. He didn't. I looked at him. What? He bought the land decades ago. Then who owns it now? A trust. I felt like I was standing inside a puzzle where every answer created 3 more questions. Samuel finally told me the story. 35. Years earlier, Arthur had been struggling to keep his small construction company alive. Banks wouldn't lend him enough money. Investors wanted control. Samuel had taken a chance on him. They made an agreement at that very overlook. Samuel would help Arthur secure his first major contract. Arthur promised that if the company ever became successful, he would never forget the people who helped him build it. He kept that promise, Samuel said. Then why involve me? Because your grandfather knew the company had become something he no longer recognized. My phone vibrated. I pulled it from my pocket, a text from my father. Where are you? Before I could respond, another message arrived. The attorney said you left with the car. Call me. Then another. This isn't something you should investigate on your own. I stared at the screen. Samuel noticed my expression. That's him. I nodded. Does he know where you are? No. Then don't tell him. I put the phone away. For the first time in my life, keeping something from my father felt necessary. I drove home later that night with the black box hidden beneath the spare tire. When I reached my driveway, my father's black Mercedes was parked across the street. He was waiting. I stopped the Explorer. My father stepped out. He looked at the old SUV, then at me. What did you find? I kept my face calm. Nothing. He stared at me. You drove 3 hours into the mountains. I wanted to see where the GPS went. Why? Curiosity. My father gave me a small smile. It wasn't the same smile from the inheritance hearing. This one was nervous. Ethan, your grandfather was sick near the end. He wasn't thinking clearly. I looked at him. Maybe. He stepped closer. Whatever he told you, whatever you think you found, let it go. I said nothing. His voice dropped. Some things are better left alone. Then he walked back toward his Mercedes. I watched him leave. For years, I had believed my father didn't care enough about me to pay attention. Now I understood something much more frightening. He had been paying attention all along. I went inside, locked the door, placed Arthur's letter on the kitchen table. Then I opened my laptop. I searched public records for the Carter Family Trust. The first result made my breath catch. The trust wasn't empty, it wasn't small. And according to the filing, I was the only individual beneficiary named in a sealed provision. I leaned back in my chair. My grandfather hadn't left me a used car because I was worth less than everyone else. He had left me something my family would never think to steal from me until they knew what it was. A secret. The next morning, I called the estate attorney, Margaret Collins. She answered on the second ring. Ethan. I found the documents. There was a pause. Then you found what Arthur wanted you to find. What exactly is the Carter Family Trust? I can't discuss the trust over the phone. Come to my office. I arrived early. Margaret closed the office door and placed a thick file on her desk. Your grandfather anticipated that you'd have questions. Did he know my father was stealing from the company? Margaret didn't answer immediately. We have evidence suggesting unauthorized transfers. Until the forensic review is complete, I won't call it theft. Who was receiving the money? She opened the file. Several consulting companies. On paper, they were legitimate. In reality, their ownership structures were deliberately complicated. She slid a page toward me. I recognized one name immediately. My father's longtime business advisor. Another company was connected to Daniel. I stared at the documents. How much? Approximately $18 million over 7 years. 18 million. I couldn't speak. Margaret continued. That's what we've identified so far. Why didn't Grandpa expose them? Because he wanted evidence strong enough to survive in court. Arthur had suspected financial misconduct, but he refused to make accusations based only on suspicion. He hired an independent forensic accountant. He quietly moved certain assets away from family control. Then Margaret told me something that changed everything. Arthur also knew someone was monitoring his communications. Who? We don't know. But he suspected my father? Yes. She opened another folder. This is your grandfather's personal memorandum. I read the first line. If Ethan is reading this, the family has already begun asking what he received. I almost smiled. Arthur knew them too well. The memorandum explained why my inheritance looked insignificant. He had deliberately separated the visible inheritance from the assets that actually mattered. The Explorer had been transferred to me because it was one of the few things nobody would fight over. Nobody would search it. nobody would suspect it. And nobody would imagine that a used vehicle contained the first clue to a financial investigation. But there was another reason. Arthur wanted to know how his family would treat me if they believed I had received nothing, and they had answered that question before lunch. Daniel laughed at me. My father smiled. Relatives stopped pretending to care. Arthur had created a test. My family had failed it. Margaret looked at me. There's more. She handed me a sealed document. This becomes active only under specific conditions. I opened it. The Carter Family Trust contained assets worth considerably more than I expected, but I couldn't access them immediately. There were conditions. I had to remain independent of the family business. I had to maintain complete financial records. And most importantly, if there was ever a conflict involving my immediate family, I had to appoint an independent trustee. Arthur had thought of everything. I looked up. Why me? Margaret smiled gently. Because your grandfather believed you were the least interested in his money. That sentence stayed with me. I left her office with copies of the documents. Then I contacted a forensic accounting firm. For the next 2 weeks, I continued working, paid my bills, and spent my nights reviewing transaction records. Patterns began to emerge. Payments were split into smaller amounts. Invoices were duplicated. Consulting fees were approved by people who benefited from them. My father had built a system. Daniel wasn't innocent either. He had received money through one of the companies. Then we found something worse. A large transfer had been made shortly before Arthur's final hospitalization. The recipient was a company controlled by Daniel. I stared at the screen. Did Grandpa know about this? The accountant nodded. That's probably why he accelerated the trust. I sat silently. Then I remembered something from childhood. I was 12 years old. My mother and father had been arguing in the kitchen. I had been lying awake upstairs. My mother said something I never forgot. You're becoming someone your father would have hated. My father slammed a cabinet door. You don't understand what it takes to protect a family. At the time, I thought they were arguing about work. Now I wasn't so sure. I searched through my mother's old belongings. In a box of photographs, I found a notebook. Most of it contained grocery lists and ordinary family notes. Near the back were several handwritten pages. My mother's handwriting. She had written dates, company names, amounts, and one sentence. Arthur is right. Something is happening with the money, but Robert says I'm imagining things. I put the notebook down. My mother had known. Maybe not everything, but enough to be afraid. Then my phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. Dad knows you're digging. Another message arrived. You should stop before you embarrass yourself. For years, words like that would have hurt. This time, they didn't. I opened the financial records. Then I opened the photograph of my grandfather and Samuel at the mountain overlook. I finally understood what Arthur wanted. He wasn't asking me to destroy my family. He was asking me to stop them from destroying themselves. I typed one reply to Daniel. I'm not digging for revenge. I paused, then added, I'm looking for the truth. A minute later, his response arrived. You have no idea who you're fighting. I stared at the screen, then I smiled. They still thought I was the fool. And that was their biggest mistake. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. I wasn't going to confront my father. I wasn't going to confront Daniel. And I wasn't going to tell anyone in the family what Arthur had left me. I called Margaret Collins. Begin the formal process with the forensic accountants. There was a pause. Are you sure? Yes. Once we do this, Ethan, there won't be a way to put everything back the way it was. I looked at Arthur's letter. I don't think it was ever the way my grandfather wanted it to be. That afternoon, the independent audit began. The Carter organization had been operating for decades, hundreds of employees, contracts across several states, accountants handling numbers far more complicated than anything I had ever dealt with. But fraud doesn't become invisible just because a company is large. It leaves patterns, and once someone knows where to look, those patterns become difficult to hide. The accountants followed the money. Payments had been divided between consulting companies. Some invoices described services that had never been performed. Others listed vague business development expenses that couldn't be verified. Then they found the connection that tied everything together. One shell company was registered to a mailing address in Delaware. The address belonged to a law firm, but the beneficial owner was hidden behind another company. That company was connected to Daniel's investment account. I stared at the documents. So Daniel knew. Margaret shook her head slightly. We can't say exactly what he knew yet, but the financial connection is significant, and my father. We found transactions connected to an account controlled by an advisor who has worked with your father for more than 20 years. I closed my eyes. The evidence was becoming impossible to dismiss. Then my phone rang. Daniel. I almost ignored it. Finally, I answered. What? His voice was unusually calm. We need to talk about what you know. I don't know what you're talking about. Ethan, he exhaled. Dad is willing to make this worth your while. What does that mean? It means you walk away. I leaned back. How? You stop cooperating with the accountants. I waited. Dad will give you $5 million. For a moment, I said nothing. $5 million. A number capable of changing someone's entire life. And my family believed it was enough to make me disappear. I thought about the inheritance hearing, the laughter, the used car. Then I remembered Arthur's words. Money is only a tool. No. Daniel's voice hardened. You're making a mistake. I don't think so. You have no idea what you're getting into. I know exactly what I'm getting into. No, you don't. He paused. Then he said something that revealed more than he intended. Grandpa wasn't as innocent as you think? My hand tightened around the phone. What does that mean? Ask yourself why he didn't tell you any of this while he was alive. Maybe he was waiting for me to find out myself. Daniel laughed bitterly. You really believe he chose you because you're special? I said nothing. Ethan, you were always the one who stayed outside the family business. You think that makes you better than us? No. Then stop acting like it. The call ended. I sat there staring at the phone. For years I had believed Daniel's arrogance came from insecurity. Now I understood it came from fear. He was afraid of losing something. Not money. Control. The next day, I met Margaret again. She told me the audit had uncovered enough evidence to warrant formal legal action. We're turning everything over. I nodded. Do it. Within weeks, the atmosphere inside the Carter organization changed. Executives who had once answered my father's calls immediately stopped returning them. Banks requested documentation. Outside counsel began reviewing contracts. The board ordered a deeper investigation, and eventually, the news reached the family. Relatives who had laughed at me began calling. My cousin Rachel was the first. Ethan, I'm so sorry. For what? For what happened at the inheritance hearing. I almost smiled. It's okay. No, it isn't. She hesitated. Do you know what Arthur actually left you? I looked out the window. Yes. Are you going to tell everyone? No. Why? Because that's exactly what everyone cared about. She didn't have an answer. Then came the other calls. An uncle wanted advice. A cousin wanted reassurance. Someone I hadn't spoken to in years asked whether I could help protect their inheritance. I refused every request, not because I wanted them to suffer, but because I needed them to understand something. Relationships couldn't be bought back with the same currency that had destroyed them. One evening, Daniel appeared outside my house. He looked different. No expensive suit, no confident smile, just a tired man standing beneath my porch light. I need to talk to you. I opened the door but didn't invite him inside. He looked down. Dad, I waited. He's scared. So am I. Daniel looked at me. You shouldn't be. Why? Because Grandpa planned all of this. I said nothing. Daniel continued. He knew Dad was moving money. That was the first time Daniel had admitted it directly. How long? He swallowed. Years. And you? He looked away. I took some. How much? He didn't answer. I didn't need him to. The investigation would tell us. Daniel looked back at me. Ethan, I know I laughed at you. Yes. I know I treated you like you were nothing. Yes. And I know I was wrong. I stared at him. What do you want from me? Nothing. That surprised me. I just wanted you to know that I was wrong. Before I could respond, Daniel turned and walked away. I watched him disappear into the darkness. For the first time, I realized revenge wasn't going to feel the way I had imagined. I had spent years imagining the day my family would finally understand my worth. But now that day had arrived, there was no satisfaction in watching them fall apart. There was only sadness. The following week, the investigation confirmed what Arthur had feared. Millions had been diverted. My father had approved suspicious transactions. Daniel had benefited from them, and both had helped conceal the financial trail. But Margaret had one more revelation for me. She placed a document on her desk. This is the final provision of Arthur's trust. I read it. Then I read it again. My grandfather hadn't simply protected money for me. He had created a charitable trust under my control. Veterans, working families, scholarships, emergency assistance, people who needed opportunity more than inheritance. I looked at Margaret. He wanted me to do this? He wanted you to decide whether you were willing to carry the responsibility. I thought about the old SUV, the mountain, Samuel, the key, and the family that had laughed because they thought I had received nothing. For the first time, I understood the real revenge. It wasn't making them poor. It wasn't humiliating them. It wasn't proving that I was worth more than they thought. It was proving that the person they considered worthless could become the one person capable of preserving what Arthur had spent his life building. Then my father came to my door. He wasn't smiling anymore. "Ethan," he said quietly, "I need to tell you the truth." He stood on my porch for nearly a minute before saying anything else. He looked older than he had a month earlier. The confidence was gone. So was the polished expression he always wore whenever money or business was involved. "I need to tell you the truth," he repeated. I stepped aside. "Come in." He entered slowly and sat at the kitchen table. For years, I had wanted my father to sit across from me like this. Not as the head of the Carter family. Not as the man everyone respected. Just as my father. Now that it was finally happening, I wasn't sure I wanted to hear what he had to say. He stared at his hands. I knew. I waited. I knew money was being moved out of the company. My chest tightened. How long? Several years. Did Grandpa know? Yes. I looked away. Then why didn't he stop you? My father shook his head. He tried. The room became silent. He explained that when Arthur first started asking questions, he believed his father was simply becoming suspicious with age. Then Arthur hired outside investigators. Robert panicked, not because he had personally created every transaction, but because he had allowed Daniel and several executives to use company money improperly. I told myself I was protecting the family. I looked at him. By stealing from the family? He flinched. I know how it sounds. It sounds exactly like what happened. He nodded. I was afraid. That answer surprised me. My father had always seemed afraid of nothing. What were you afraid of? He looked toward the window. That I would never be enough. He took a breath. Your grandfather built everything. Every house we lived in. Every vacation. Every opportunity. People compared me to him my entire life. Then he looked at me. And I made the same mistake with Daniel that my father made with me. What mistake? I taught him that money was proof of worth. His voice cracked slightly. When you were young, you didn't care about any of that. You wanted to work with your hands. You liked fixing things. You could spend an entire afternoon repairing an old motorcycle and never ask how much it was worth. He gave a sad smile. I should have been proud. But you weren't. I was afraid. Of me? He nodded. Afraid that Arthur would respect you more than he respected me. That confession hurt more than I expected. I had spent years thinking my father simply didn't see me. The truth was worse. He saw me. He just saw me as a threat to his own insecurity. Why did you let Daniel laugh at me? My father lowered his head. Because I was relieved when you weren't interested in the money. I stared at him. I thought, if you stayed away from the business, you couldn't expose what was happening. I stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the street looked completely ordinary. A neighbor walked a dog. A delivery truck stopped at a house. Children rode bicycles. Nobody looking at that quiet neighborhood would have guessed that one family was falling apart over millions of dollars. What happens now? I asked. My father sighed. I'll have to face the consequences. That isn't an answer. No. He looked at me. I don't expect you to protect me. Good. He nodded. I also don't expect forgiveness. I didn't respond. Because I didn't know if I could forgive him. Not yet. The investigation continued. Accountants recovered several $1 million through frozen accounts and improperly transferred assets. Other money was harder to trace. My father eventually cooperated after realizing the evidence was overwhelming. Daniel did too. Neither cooperation erased what they had done. There were legal consequences, financial consequences, and consequences inside the family that money couldn't repair. But something else happened. For the first time, my father stopped trying to control the outcome. He stopped calling relatives. He stopped pressuring attorneys. He stopped trying to convince everyone that he had simply been misunderstood. He accepted responsibility. That mattered to me, not enough to erase the past, but enough to leave a door open. A few weeks later, I drove the Explorer back to the mountain overlook. Samuel was there. He sat on the hood of his pickup, drinking coffee from a metal thermos. He looked at me. You look different. I feel different. He handed me a cup. I sat beside him. My father confessed. Samuel nodded. Arthur expected that. I smiled. That was Arthur. I pulled the final letter from my jacket. I found something else in the trust documents. Samuel looked at me. What? Arthur created a charitable fund. For what? Veterans, working families, scholarships, emergency assistance. Samuel smiled. He wanted you to understand where the money came from. What do you mean? When Arthur started his first company, he had almost nothing. People gave him opportunities. He believed the right thing to do was pass that opportunity forward. I looked at the mountains. I thought my inheritance was a punishment. Samuel chuckled. That was the point. I smiled. Then he said something I'll never forget. Your grandfather didn't trust you with money, Ethan. I looked at him. He trusted you with what money could become. For the first time since the inheritance hearing, the weight in my chest began to lift. I finally understood. Arthur hadn't wanted me to win against my family. He wanted me to win against the temptation to become like them. A few days later, Daniel called. I want to apologize. I sat quietly while he spoke. I laughed at you. Yes. I thought you were beneath me. Yes. I was wrong. I could hear the shame in his voice. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't know if I can yet. I understand. We stayed silent. Then I said something I hadn't expected myself to say. But I don't want us to spend the rest of our lives hating each other. Daniel took a breath. Neither do I. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. There were no hugs, no dramatic promises, just two brothers admitting that something had gone terribly wrong and deciding not to make it worse. That was enough for one day. My father eventually began rebuilding his life outside the family business. Daniel sold several unnecessary properties and began repaying what he could, and I started the charitable trust. I helped fund veteran housing programs, scholarships, emergency grants for working families. The first time I signed a grant check, I thought about the used Explorer sitting in my driveway. A car worth a fraction of what everyone else had received, yet that car had carried me to the truth. It had taken me to Samuel. It had taken me to Arthur's final lesson, and it had taken me back to myself. Months later, I drove the Explorer to the mountain again. I parked beside the overlook and looked at the valley below. For years, I had thought wealth meant having more than everyone else. Arthur taught me something different. Wealth could mean having enough courage to tell the truth, enough wisdom to walk away from greed, enough humility to forgive without forgetting, and enough compassion to use what you have to help someone else stand back up. I finally understood why my grandfather gave me the inheritance nobody wanted. The used car wasn't worthless. It was a roadmap, and I had finally learned how to follow it. The first time I took the Explorer to my father's house after everything was over, I almost turned around. For years, that house had represented everything I thought I had failed to become. My father had built his life around appearances. The right neighborhood, the right car, the right business connections, the right son. And for most of my childhood, I thought that son was Daniel. But that afternoon, something had changed. My father was standing on the front porch when I pulled into the driveway. He looked at the old Explorer and smiled faintly. "I still can't believe Arthur left you that thing." I laughed. "Neither can I." Dad walked toward the vehicle. "Does it still run better than most people in this family?" I laughed. He laughed too. It was the first time we'd laughed together in years. We stood beside the Explorer for a moment without saying anything. Then Dad looked at me. "I owe you an apology." I didn't answer. "I've apologized before," he continued. "But I don't think I ever actually told you what I'm sorry for." I waited. "I spent years making you feel like you weren't enough." His voice became quieter. "I compared you to Daniel. I compared you to Arthur. I compared you to every successful person I knew." He looked down, "And I made you believe that if you weren't wealthy, powerful, or impressive, you didn't matter." I looked away. He was right. There were birthdays when Daniel received expensive gifts and I received a handshake. There were family dinners where Daniel's business stories lasted an hour while my work was barely mentioned. There were moments when I wanted my father's approval so badly that I changed parts of myself just to earn it. Eventually, I stopped trying. "I should have told you I was proud of you," Dad said. I looked at him. "Why didn't you?" He swallowed. "Because I was jealous." That word hung between us. Not anger. Not greed. Jealousy. It was the one thing my father had never admitted. I was jealous because Arthur trusted you. I looked toward the mountains in the distance. I didn't know that he did. Dad smiled sadly. "Your grandfather used to tell me that you were the one person in the family who didn't need him." I felt something tighten in my chest. "He said that?" "More than once." I shook my head. "I wish I'd known." "So do I." We stood there quietly. Then Dad said something that stayed with me. "I know forgiveness doesn't happen because I ask for it." "No," he nodded, "but it can happen because you change." I looked at him. He was right. That was all I needed to hear. Not a promise that everything would suddenly become perfect, just an admission that change required work. Later that week, Daniel came to see me. He looked uncomfortable standing in my doorway. I brought something. He handed me a small cardboard box. Inside was an old family photograph. Arthur stood in the center. My father was beside him. Daniel was a little boy, and I was maybe 6 years old, standing near my grandfather's leg. I turned the photograph over. There was handwriting on the back. "The boys will understand someday." I stared at it. "Grandpa wrote this?" Daniel nodded. "I found it in Dad's desk." I smiled sadly. Maybe he knew. Daniel laughed quietly. He usually did. We sat there for a while without speaking. Then Daniel said, "I'm sorry." I looked at him. "I know." "No, Ethan, I really am." He looked down at his hands. "I spent my entire life thinking I had to beat you." "You didn't." "I know that now." He laughed softly. "That's the stupid part. You weren't even competing with me." "No. I was competing with a version of you that existed in my head." That was probably the most honest thing my brother had ever said to me. I didn't forgive him instantly. Real forgiveness doesn't work that way. But I decided I didn't want anger to become another inheritance. We agreed to stay in contact slowly, carefully, one conversation at a time. Some things would never return to the way they had been. Maybe that was okay. Some families don't need to go backward. They need to move forward differently. By then, the Carter Charitable Trust was operating. The first scholarships went to students whose parents worked hourly jobs. The first emergency, Grants helped families pay rent and medical bills after unexpected layoffs. We partnered with organizations supporting veterans transitioning into civilian life. I signed every approval personally, not because I wanted control, because I wanted to remember what Arthur had taught me. Money wasn't the destination, it was the vehicle. And suddenly, the old explorer sitting outside my office seemed almost funny. A billionaire had given his grandson a used car, and somehow that car had carried more meaning than millions of dollars. One Saturday morning, I drove back to the mountain overlook. Samuel was waiting. He was older than he looked when I first met him, but there was still strength in his posture. "You came back," he said. I wanted to say thank you. He waved me off. "Thank your grandfather." I already did. Samuel smiled. We stood beside the railing. The valley below was covered in golden morning light. I thought about the day I had arrived there, angry and confused. I thought I had been cheated. I thought everyone else had won. I thought my grandfather had chosen me last. I couldn't have been more wrong. He had given me a test. More importantly, he had given me a choice. I could become bitter. I could spend my life trying to punish everyone who had underestimated me. Or I could take what happened, learn from it, and use the opportunity to become someone my grandfather would have been proud of. I chose the second. Before I left, I sat inside the Explorer and turned on the GPS. The saved destination still said, "Home." I smiled. For the first time, I understood what Arthur had meant. Home wasn't a house, it wasn't a bank account, it wasn't a family name. Home was the place where you could finally stop proving your worth. I turned off the GPS. Then I started the engine. As I drove down the mountain, I realized something. The greatest revenge wasn't watching my father lose everything. It wasn't watching my brother apologize. It wasn't proving that I was worth more than they thought. The greatest revenge was refusing to become the kind of person who had hurt me. My grandfather left millions behind. But what he really left me was something harder to measure. Wisdom, responsibility, and the courage to choose who I wanted to become. Sometimes life gives you something that looks worthless because you're looking at its price instead of its purpose. Sometimes the people who underestimate you are accidentally giving you freedom. And sometimes forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting what happened. It means learning from it without allowing it to poison the rest of your life. Because in the end, my grandfather's greatest inheritance wasn't the money. It wasn't the trust. It wasn't even the charitable foundation. It was the lesson hidden inside an old Ford Explorer that nobody else wanted. They laughed because they thought I had received nothing. But that was exactly why I received everything that mattered. And maybe that's the lesson worth remembering. The thing everyone else dismisses may be the very thing that changes your life. The person everyone underestimates may be the one person capable of seeing the truth. And sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't what someone leaves in your name. It's what they leave inside you.